Hello, my name is Joanne Murphy. I am Chief Operating Officer at the Chartered Banking Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our webcast today, Rising Up Women in the Workplace, with our partners from the Manchester Metropolitan University and the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales, in celebration of International Women's Day, which is tomorrow. I'm delighted to welcome our panel today, including Louisa Pollard, who's Head of Litigation at Co-op Bank. Welcome, Louisa.
Hi, Jo. Thank you. Hi, everybody.
Hi, Louisa. We also have with us Iwi Yungabi Green, who's a reader at Manchester Metropolitan University. Hi, Iwi. Great to see you again.
Hi, Jo. Thank you. Hi, everybody.
And our third panelist is also hopefully well known to you, David Nikolic, who is the Managing Director at Abstract. Welcome, David.
Hi, Jo. Hi, everyone.
The theme of International Women's Day for 2024 is all about inspiring for inclusion. And the campaign is about encouraging the understanding of the value of women in the workplace and fostering a sense of belonging, relevance, and empowerment. By inspiring others to embrace diversity and actively include women in all fields of endeavour, we collectively move towards a more inclusive world for everybody. This event is really to shed light on the progress made in advancing gender diversity within banking, accounting, and the finance sectors, highlighting what's been effective in the initiatives and the strategies so far, but we'll also explore the current landscape of gender equality in the workplace and uncover some practical insights about how do you embody that within your organisation. This is an interactive session, so we'd welcome questions from the audience if you'd like to join us through our chat function too. So we'll kick off. We've got an hour to have a conversation, and I always find that they overrun. So let's just get started with some of our questions. So David, I'm going to really come to you first of all and just ask, what are the key indicators of progression in promoting gender diversity within banking and finance?
Yeah, it's a great question to kick off because I think there are very positive indicators. We're seeing certainly in the UK that board positions are increasing to around 40% in the FTSE 100. The people we work with, we are seeing a much greater gender diversity in and across the businesses. So there are very positive signs. However, having said that, there are contradictory signs as well, because a lot of the women in C-suites are non-exec director positions. And therefore, as a result of that, they're sort of skewing the figures somewhat. And that may go some way towards the gender pay gap actually showing a differential in. So if there are more women in the business, in the industry, for example, then why is the pay gap not moving as much as it should? And I read this week that I think there was 17% of large firms are still not reporting their gender pay gap. So that there has to be some sort of commitment, some demonstrable commitment from businesses that it's not just quotas, it's not just ticking boxes, it's actually all part of inclusivity. Now, I think Jo may have frozen up there. So if she has, I'm going to step into the chair. We were warned that she may actually have internet problems. So let me just, Iwi, does that resonate with yourself?
Yeah, no, definitely. I'd say representation is really important. When we look to the numbers about a decade ago, we had 28 women for every 3,268 men in sort of the banking and finance industry. And thankfully, we've seen movement there. 30% is kind of considered as the sweet spot for minority voices to be heard. And, in the UK, 17% of women who are in these executive roles on the boards, as you say, a lot of them are in non-exec positions. So I think there is something around who's in the room making the decisions that points to some movement that's still needed in terms of representation. But I would say that there are also kind of other indicators that point to some of the sort of invisible cultural norms that maybe just having women, as important as it is, in the boardroom making those decisions, indicate that we still have some way to go. So obviously you've spoken about the gender pay gap, and it is a challenge in getting organisations to report on those gaps. I think there is also work that needs to be done in terms of what do we do with that data and that information. I think there is things around sexual harassment, for example, and the reporting levels, proxy variables for belonging. So, you know, are women staying in the organisation? Are they being retained? Are they being progressed? Are they being invested in? Are they able to access those opportunities for progression if they choose to and they want to? Is there sponsorship? Is there advocacy? Is there mentorship within the organisation? And we know very contemporary issues that are now being discussed openly, which is great, around the menopause, for example, menstruation, trans inclusion. You know, what do these things look like? Are these conversations happening, and what do they look like in terms of policy and practice? And how are those sort of marginalised groups or women experiencing those issues, actually experiencing being in the workplace? Are they taking extra 6 days because there isn't a space, you know, for them to have that conversation with their line manager, or to sort of access systems of support, and so they're feeling anxious or inadequate, or, you know, taking early retirement even? So I think there is definitely indicators that point to kind of structural issues around policy and practice, but it's also the little stuff, you know, like who's going to the award ceremonies, who gets spotlighted, you know, who is celebrated and valued within the organisation. And I think certainly there's a way to go.
Yeah,
there's a way for us to go. Yeah,
I think you made some fantastic points there with regards to all the layers that sit underneath just the statistics of women in business or in the banking finance sector. They often get lost, those sort of layers, you know, and I've heard this week a few people saying, you know, however we package women's, you know, International Women's Day, you know, it's becoming tiresome, for example. Yet we haven't pushed the pendulum so far one way that it still can't come back. You know, we've still got to do more, and hopefully in 10, 15 years time, we won't need to have these conversations. But right now, Iwi, you know, how do you respond to people who are probably saying, yeah, that's all well and good, but let's just get on with it?
I mean, how long have you got?
You've got 2 minutes, because I'm coming to Louisa.
Need to bring Louisa in, definitely. I mean, you know, ultimately for me, and anyone who knows me on the call will know that I try to use my voice to advocate for marginalised and minoritised groups within social systems. And I think that we still, and we'll probably come on to this when we talk about attitudes and behaviours maybe, but I think there is still a model of leadership that is used that does not necessarily speak to the positionality and the perspectives that women bring into the workplace and should be valued. And therefore what you find is women trying to mimic certain behaviours and ways of being in organisations that kind of others them or is harmful, you know, is really, really harmful. And I think that there is a place for reporting and a place for moving that forward, and actually even things like disaggregating the data, because women aren't a monolith. So, you know, there's that side of things as well. But I think that these other kind of cultural practices that sit underneath that is really where the work needs to happen. And I think there's a lot of compliance work going on at the moment, but actually that kind of roots and branches approach to the cultural changes that need to be made is really where we are and where we need to move forward.
Yeah, couldn't agree with you more. I think you're absolutely right. So thanks, Iwi. Louisa, if I can come to you, what initiatives or programs have been successful in showcasing the diverse career paths available within the banking industry and encouraging young talent to explore these opportunities further?
I think thanks for the points you've raised, both of you, because I think what you've said touches on what I was thinking about when I was thinking about the initiatives in place, and particularly representation, choice, the different layers. It's not just a one size fits all, which links into sort of the need for different policies. I mean, for me, thinking about it's all about inspiring young people, and this point about representation being really important, and you know, you can't be what you can't see, and I've seen really successful initiatives where I've worked in the past, where we've gone into schools and colleges and universities, and on careers days, or doing sort of mock interviews, mock panels, talking to pupils and students about what it means to work in finance, what it, you know, it's traditionally a very male dominated industry, what the job involves, what skills are needed. I mean, you know, I trained as a lawyer. I work in the in-house legal team at the Co-op Bank. It's you might not think you could work as a lawyer in a bank. It's, you know, and I wouldn't have had a clue when I was, you know, doing my GCSEs that was an option. We've done days for state school students where they've come in and spent a day with the bank, and we've arranged sessions from different teams. So, you know, the marketing team have run a session with the finance, the legal team, so they can actually, you know, have that opportunity to talk to people and find out what you know, what do you do every day, what's involved, what do you need to do to get to where you are. For me, I think those sorts of initiatives are really, really important at different stages of sort of career progression, but right from school, really.
Yeah, I think that's a great point that you mentioned, that you can't be what you can't see, and that experiential sort of development of the young coming into the industry is absolutely critical. I would also argue perhaps that it's not just seeing representation, it's seeing rock stars. You know, it's seeing those people who are like, you know, wow, these are the people, like, you know, the role models, the culture carriers, you know, that I want to see. So it's not just positions, it's the real rock stars. Would you agree?
The inspiration, isn't it? It's the, you know, yeah, going in and inspiring people to think, oh, that sounds great. That sounds really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, great.
I would just say to that point though, I actually do agree, and it's going to sound like I don't agree, but I do agree with the point that you make. I think there is something around what I always call the myth of meritocracy, which I don't want to go down a rabbit hole with, but just to say there are mediocre men who are in quite high profile positions. And I think the idea of exceptionalism can be a bit problematic. So I think you're absolutely right. As I say, I agree in the sense that when I think about my own career trajectory, or how I might view the next milestones or steps in my career, I look to those people who have obviously been there as role models. But I think it's important to recognise that within organisations there are people who get into quite, you know, high positions who I would argue perhaps don't model all the values and traits that I might associate with an exceptional leader, but still manage to get there. And I think, again, that just surfaces some of the inequalities in the system. Just to add to a couple of the initiatives, if I may, if that's okay. The 30% Club, I don't know if everyone's heard of the 30% Club, but coming back to this point I'd made about the 30% being the sweet spot of minority voices being heard. CEOs and chairs of organisations got together in 2011 to set up this amazing 30% Club, which basically tries to increase gender diversity on boards. And I think, David, you spoke about some of the differences across different global jurisdictions in that, and as I say, as the UK have got quite a long way to go. But you know, we need that kind of that level of intervention to move things forward. I think something that Louisa spoke about, the importance of like partnerships and working collaboratively, you know, and I think I would say this, but universities are a great place to do that. There's an initiative by the London Institute of Banking called REACH, and they worked with some banks to develop a program that was like awareness workshops, mentoring, and really sort of demystified a career in finance. And it's all about sort of enabling and empowering women in social mobility in banking. Returnships, which I think are amazing. So, you know, we know one of the issues disproportionately impacting women to lead to career breaks are all the sorts of things we've spoken about. And it can be really hard for a woman when she comes back, she or they come back into the workplace to think they've been forgotten about, they're not valued in the same way, they need to upskill, you know, and these returnships are offered by about 20 organisations across the centre, Investec, JP Morgan, Bank of England, Lloyds, including others. You know, they're like these paid returnships for 3 to 6 months, where basically it's a bridging programme where women can make mistakes, they can get used to stuff, they get paid, and can really build confidence to them getting back into the workplace. So the very last thing that I'll mention is around decent work and financial inclusion. I think, you know, there's been reports by the World Bank that women are more likely to be in poverty than men for various reasons. And actually, if we're looking at inclusion more broadly, financial inclusion is a huge problem for women wanting to start up businesses, having control over their finances, and there are various initiatives around financial inclusion which are really important. And the decent little shout out, decent work knowledge platform that we've got at Manchester Met, and doing great work in this space as well. So if anyone's interested in collaborating, please get in touch, I can put you forward. Right. My little plug over.
Right. You've got that in, you can relax now. Thanks for that. I think you've made some fabulous points there, and you know, I would agree entirely that, you know, things like return to work is definitely getting a much bigger profile. We're seeing call for coaching for return to work is much stronger than it's ever been. You know, it used to be the preserve of the elite, but now we're democratizing coachings for everybody, and that, you know, we're seeing a much bigger take up. But I do have to come back about your comment about mediocre men in high positions. I'm going to take that one step further. There are some terrible men in the high positions, and I know a few of them. So, you know, as far as I'm concerned, when I talk about rock stars, I'm talking everybody. It's not women or you know, underrepresented groups. It is everybody needs to be a rock star when you look up. You know, it can't just be mediocrity. You know, it has to be you know, sort of, this is why I'm here. This is where I want to be. These are role models to look up to. And so, you know, that for me is really, really important in all of this, because you have a lot of people at the top of the helm who are probably extraordinarily versed in IQ. So they have this great intellectual quotient. Their emotional quotient probably starts to diminish. And by the time they get to their cultural quotient, it's probably non-existent. So, you know, the IQ, EQ, and CQ is now a prerequisite for rock stars. So, you know, this is work we're doing with executives at the moment. So, you know, that's really, really important. So thank you for mentioning that. Joe's gone. Louisa, I'm going to come back to you. As a professional in the banking sector, what challenges have you encountered, and how have you overcome them in your career, particularly in fostering diversity and inclusion?
So I think the main challenge that I've had when I suppose when I think about being a woman is balancing family life and you mentioned here the return to work policy. I'd say when being a lawyer, I trained at a big corporate firm where the culture at the time was very much 12, 13-hour days in the office. Working from home was non-existent. I couldn't see, to your rock star point, David, I couldn't see men or women. Well, I could see men at the top. I couldn't see inspirational women who I wanted to, you know, who I wanted to be, who I thought, you know, that's something to aspire to. And I certainly couldn't see reaching a senior position and having children. I've got 2 boys, they're 7 and 10 now. But when I after having my first, I came to the bank initially on secondment, and that ended up being a permanent position. And it gave me the opportunity to work 3 days a week when my children were very small, which was a choice. And I think we've made that point. I think it's all this is all about choice, because that's not what everybody would want to do. But for me, that was what I wanted to do. It meant that I could do that for a few years and then almost build my career back up again. And I think COVID and the impact of COVID in showing that actually you can work from home, we can have kind of hybrid working, you do not need to be in the office for 12 hours a day. That's shown that flexibility can work. So I've sort of gone around the houses a bit with your question, David, but I think the challenge for me has been being able to have career progression and think, how do I try to balance that with having a family and the other things that I want to do in my life. I think a few years ago it probably seemed impossible, and I think without the advances that we've had over the last couple of years in terms of flexibility and hybrid working, for me personally, that without that I wouldn't be able to do the job that I do today. That I can make that work with popping out to do the school run a couple of days a week, and works for me to pick things up in the evenings and work late a couple of nights a week. That's how, and I think we're going to come on to talk about engaging men, aren't we? But and to your rock star point, David, but it's all about having this is everybody's responsibility. I feel like it sort of goes without saying that the benefits of a diverse workplace go without saying. So it's not a question of should men be part of the conversation. It's a question of that they've got to be. They absolutely are, because this isn't a female issue. It's an issue that affects society. So we should be discussing solutions that work. It shouldn't be a how do we get, and I know it has to be this to a point, how do we get women back into work? But the flexible options I have, I want my husband to take up too. I want him to be, which he does, but that shouldn't be a male female split.
It shouldn't be a guilt trip either, should it? It should
no.
It should be actually, this is what I do, and it's a badge of honor. I'm working this really, really well, and I'm as productive as I've ever been. I'm a brilliant professional, but I'm a great mum or father as well. That's where we need to be.
And I think the more that we can get women and men sort of modeling those behaviors, the more that you get links back to the young people. And I mean, I frequently get asked when I do these days with students and in initiatives, how do you balance a career and family? It's not just a question for people later on in their careers. Students are interested in that. They're interested in flexible working and work-life balance. How it might be a career that's okay in your early 20s, but how do you make that work when you're in your 40s?
If you have a look at the generations that are working at the moment, Louisa, you've got probably 4 generations working, from baby boomers to Gen X to millennials to Gen Zs. And the Gen Zs are the inclusive generation. They understand it, they get it, So if they're coming into a situation that doesn't feel right, the environment's not right, then they're not going to stick around, or they're not even going to enter. So we have to have, again, demonstrable sort of ethics that allow people to be themselves and to be authentic. And this is how I operate. Great, good for you.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I actually find that if you do that, I may have been lucky, but I've had nothing but support over the last few years in terms of. I've never had somebody say, I work 4 days a week now, but you only work part-time. So what about, you can't have that project, you can't work on that case, or well, we need you we need you to work on the Friday. We know you don't, but we need you to. I've had nothing but, you know, encouragement. And actually, if I have to say, I'm sorry, that's actually, that time is a time that I can't do. I can do this time, or I could do this time. Absolutely fine.
Listen to how you're talking about how well you're treated, and that's infectious, isn't it? You know, that culture just permeates and spreads, and the word gets out, which is really good. Iwi, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I guess a couple of things very briefly about my own experience, and then I think you asked about how organisations might be able to kind of support.
Yeah.
So 3 years ago, there were 28 Black women professors out of over 17,000 in the UK. And they brought in various initiatives to address that, because actually when you look at an undergraduate population in higher education, we're actually overrepresented. So in the UK, it's like 4% of Black people, but 8% of the student population is Black, so overrepresented, but very underrepresented, as I say, at the professoriate level. And that positive action is about opening up opportunity. It isn't about giving people stuff that they don't deserve. That positive action has led to us now having 66 Black women, which is brilliant, but obviously not where we need to be. So my own experience is kind of professor is the next level for me. It's quite hard to find role models, or to sort of speak to people that might have faced similar challenges to me in my career. And I think the point around the diversity of women, even as women, is quite important. You know, we look at the FTSE 100, there's no Black women. 3 years ago, there were no Black men or Black people in sort of top 3 positions on boards. So it's hard. I think for organisations, I think what they really need to do is the point that you and Louisa have already made about meeting people where they are and recognising that people are individuals. And you have to make your culture inclusive by design. It's not about adding on or bolting on policies to sort of address particular issues that surface at particular times. We really, really need to be inclusive by design. And that takes work, and it takes engaging with, you know, like employee groups like employee resource groups, ERGs, which are, you know, staff-led, really great spaces to hear staff voices and to mobilise initiatives, and to just understand what it is to be a woman working in the workplace, and you know, how some of the things that Louisa had spoken about as a mum, as a working mum working 4 days a week, present themselves in day-to-day life. So I think that's really important. I think also though, it's about fostering cultures of trust. I think this is kind of where some of the issues, sticky issues, are for women in the workplace, because there's a fear around some of the things that are needed, and that makes you be positioned as inferior, because you need accommodations to meet the things that the things that you're facing in order to be able to do the job that you need to do. And so then women don't speak out because they're worried and mistrustful of the consequences of that. So I think for me, it's meeting people where they are and engaging with staff to really, and not playing lip service to it. If you're not going to do it, don't do it. It's harmful. It's so harmful to people, you know. I'll be quiet now because I could talk about this at length. We've got other things to talk about.
That's great. Thank you both. I'm conscious Joe's back in the room. So thank you, Joe. I think we're on question 4 if you want to take over.
I think you've been doing a fantastic job, actually. So I don't know if I was just going to let you go ahead and do it, but I think actually just on Iwi's point, I think that is so important, is that culturally organizations can have these policies and these procedures, but if you don't feel psychologically safe, if that's not really the way things work in reality, then people can't take advantage of those opportunities. And I think that's why you know, we have to get to this place where it's fairer for all, that even for men, you know, it's great. There's opportunities now for men to have more like paternity leave now. But actually, even culturally, compared to their peers, how's that going to be accepted? Are they going to have this childhood penalty applied to them that they've taken 3 or 4 or 6 months out of the workplace? I do think times are changing, and I do hope that that does mean that the next generation have got different expectations of employers. And I think, to your point, just as I was joining, David, I think people will walk with their feet. You know, if they don't feel they're being treated well, and if they don't feel that they're getting the support that they need and the balance that they need in their life to allow them to fulfill their own aspirations, whether that's having children, having a successful career, and I think people will, you know, people will do that. And one of the things about society just now is it's much more vocal. You know, we can hear it all around us with social media and things. We can hear all of that. So I think there's some really great points there. I think actually, Evie, can I come back to you actually on a question, if it hasn't already been covered, just about like the young people that are coming through university just now? Just what is their expectations about, you know, about the workplace and what they expect from employers?
Yeah. So I sit as an advisor to the Good and Fair Employers Club, which is like a group of the top 20 graduate recruiters in the country. And this is an issue that bounces around a lot, because they are actually finding that they're being challenged by young people in recruitment and selection processes, because, as I'm sure, you know, lots of us know, young people tend to be quite values led. So salary is still important, and that can kind of have some influence on mobility. But actually, we know from lots of research that social justice issues are really important, sustainability is really important. Basically, the purpose and the societal impact that organisations have on society is really important to people, even at graduate entry level. So where you might think, oh my gosh, a student's desperate for a job, that is obviously still certainly true, but in terms of choice and where they will apply to go to, they do their research around mission, around purpose, around kind of reputation, all those sorts of things. I think once the attraction piece is there, it becomes like, what's my experience going to be working for this organisation? So I speak a lot to students that will say to me, well, I'm not going to apply to this organisation because there's no one that looks like me on senior management teams or boards, so why would I go there? There are students that I've spoken to that have decided not to take up positions in tax because they've kind of felt that it's exploitative, the practices around it are kind of exploitative, and they've chosen to go into other fields. There's something around benefits that I think is really important for students as well, and the flexibility of working, as we say. So this idea that organisations, some of whom are going back to how things were, like this culture of presenteeism and having to be at work 5 days a week in the office, is not something that students want. They want that hybrid and they expect it. And this is the big challenge that's facing a lot of the employers that I'm speaking to at the moment, how to recruit the best talent when their expectations are not necessarily aligned to the practices of organisations. But certainly, as I say, mission, purpose, value and values, but also the personal benefits that students will get in working there are definitely driving decision making.
I think that's really, it's a really thought-provoking statement, and actually for employers, I think that's something that they really need to consider. Going back to that, like, do we walk the talk about what we're saying? Because young people can see through those grand statements. But if you're right, if you can't see somebody that looks like you or speaks like you, then probably not going to think that you've got a career or a place in that organisation at all. So it tends to lead you away. Just, David, see if I can just bring you in here, because obviously there's been a lot of work around organisations doing the work to get the talent in. But I think, as Evie alludes to, they might not stay. And certainly we can see in lots of organisations, and even with the figures that are coming out, you know, there's a step back from some of the initiatives. and we still don't have progression as much as we should through the ranks when we look at how the workforce is segmented. So, you know, there's this challenge to progression is still there for us. And what do you think really for the retention of women from diverse backgrounds in the banking sector? What do you think that needs to happen to actually retain the talent once you get in, and even like for younger people once we get in, how do we keep it there?
Yeah, and it's a $64 million question, isn't it, in a way, because you know, if you could bottle that, that would be great, but it's not that difficult. It's actually is providing budget to invest in people, and it's not just people. If you think about, we're trying to get more inclusive, we're trying to get more people onto boards, more people through the system to have great careers in the mode that they want, to be professional and also have their own lives. What we need is what we call the talent pool to actually grow from inception all the way through to the board. And that talent pool is critical. You break that chain and suddenly all you can do is go and recruit somebody who's already on that status and bring them in. And the problem we got at the moment, because the talent pool is broken in virtually every organization, what they're doing is they're going and recruiting the competitors' people to come on because you represent what we're looking for. And there's an old saying that people who are like each other tend to like each other. So if you're coming into somewhere where you're not like someone, you're not going to like it. Too many likes in there, I know. But, you know, in general, Joe, I do feel that mid-talent pool is the key. And budgets are being cut all the time. And the first thing, you get some headwinds against you and you get some challenges in the organization. You know, profit's not a dirty word. You've got to get enough revenue in. You've got to get your expenditure down. You know, so revenue up, expenditure down, get your profit. If one's not going, you cut your expenditure. I would absolutely implore people to keep their learning and development budget for their talent pool, because it is going to be the future of their business.
I think that's a really, you know, really strong point, and that you put across there, and compelling argument. How do you think we can keep organisations accountable, though, David? I'm going to come back to you on this one. How do we keep the accountability in place? You know, for their commitment, we're seeing these budgets being cut for the initiatives such as D&I, and we haven't got it right. We haven't moved the dial as much as we would like to. We still have to have International Women's Day.
So organisations like this, you know, events like this, inclusive companies, organisations like ours, like Abstract. But what I would say is it comes down to the leadership. You know, you've got to have good leaders. You've got to have inclusive leaders. And Iwi was talking about this earlier, about having mediocre people in top positions. And we have to keep banging the drum that it's not just about your revenue today. And, you know, the system supporting the system, Joe, has been far too long orientated around short-term gains and profits. And, you know, let's look at this year, you know, the AGM coming up. Let's make sure the accounting looks right for the shareholder, et cetera, et cetera. But we've got to think of the longer term. And holding these people account. We're having conversations. We have difficult conversations with leaders on a regular basis. Some of it's quite uncomfortable, but, you know, we have to not laud people who are not doing what needs to be done. We have to call it out. And, you know, people like Iwi and Louisa, you know, being, you know, the voices of reason, you know, everybody needs to shout it up. And we have an old saying in our business that says, if you don't see something that's right, just call out sabotage. And it goes back to manuals that we found we did some research on manuals going back to the World War II, where secret agents behind enemy lines actually created manuals how to sabotage something without being spotted. And it was interesting in management positions in 1944, I think it was, they brought out sabotage in management. And it was things like talk for as long as you can, create committees for committees, only promote people who are like you. And it was all in here. And I'm thinking, we're still doing that today, you know. So I would say call out sabotage and don't put up with it.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Louisa, anything you would want to sort of build on David's point?
No, I think it's a really good point, and I think it's sort of, I suppose it's linked to having a culture that encourages people to speak up and speak openly and feel that they can challenge and feel that they can point out when things could be done better or when something isn't quite working. I think that's really important too, because if you work in a culture where, or you've created a culture where it's just what I say goes and that's the end of it, and there's no opportunity for challenge or for, you know, constructive challenge or for conversations on improvement. And I think there are different ways, aren't there, to have for those conversations to take place. And Iwi, you mentioned sort of employee committees, and I mean that we've got that kind of thing. We've got various employee groups where different events are discussed or different policies and procedures are discussed, and they're then viewed by our executive, you know, our management committees, our executive, and, you know, ultimately the board. There are more informal chats, there are, you know, committees, the different way that those comments can be, and that feedback, I suppose, can be given. But I think having that sort of, or trying to have that culture where those conversations can take place is really important too.
I think to build on that point as well, it's for organisations to think about those. It's great to have groups working on policies and procedures. I think that's essential, because if you're not getting the outcome that you want, if you're not getting the talent pipeline, then something's wrong with your process. So, you know, there's something in the process within the structures that's meaning that you don't get to the outcome that you want. And I think that's really important, that they do engage colleagues and they look widely at what they do and how they do it, so that they can actually make the change happen. Because otherwise you just get the same result, which is, you know, not as a diverse workforce as we would like. Iwi, can I bring you back in just on a point round about engaging men in diversity and inclusion, because I'm curious about like young men coming into the workplace now. And obviously, you know, we hear the phrase a lot about male allies. As a mother of two men, actually, I suppose, you know, a teenager and a 20-year-old now, you know, I hear them getting their perception of hearing what's going on in the world. There's lots of influences and social media affecting them as well about what they're hearing, and there is real, even there's information coming out just now about the real shift in political preferences and stuff for young men and women, that there's a bit of a gap forming in our attitudes towards different aspects that's grown, and I think been heightened by social media. So really interested in your thoughts about, you know, what's the take young men about, how do we involve them in the conversation in diversity and inclusion, because it is about creating a more fairer society for everybody to get the benefit of it. But just really your thoughts on that.
I think what you just said at the end, Jo, about these issues being framed as an everybody issue, not just like a women's issue, is really, really important, because I think what we find is that instead of people understanding that the pie is getting bigger, they just kind of think about, oh my gosh, I'm not getting this piece of the pie anymore. You know, I'm losing out because somebody else is gaining. And I think there needs to be a reframing around this conversation that locks into young men understanding this. And I think some of this comes from some of these conversations being had outside of the mainstream. So if I think about education, for example, I think, you know, David came in and did a session for me on one of my units where we were talking about leadership. And inclusive intentional leadership should be an integral part of that. It shouldn't be seen as something that is separate to that. It's leadership, it's good leadership. And I think sometimes some of these conversations become so separate from the conversations that we have with our young men that, as I say, they then have a perception that these issues don't impact on them. And if we make advances in these spaces, that they're missing out. And of course, we know the Andrew Tates of this world, you know, promote masculinity in a particular way that will speak to some impressionable men. But I think, you know, as you go through life and have more experiences and the role of education and all the rest of it, that it's a mindset that changes. And I do think, you know, I've got a little boy, he's 7. So it's hard to say exactly what his place in the world will look like, but he has a sister, he has a mum, he has women relatives. And I would hope that we are sort of reinforcing those values in our interactions with him and influencing how he sees the world and, you know, the sorts of things that he would want his sisters to enjoy and experience. So I think, in my usual way, a very roundabout way of saying it's an everybody problem. It's something where we need to normalize things like parental leave. They do it in Germany, you know, yes. They share leave, it's normalized. It's not even thought about, and we need to kind of bring those sort of mainstream policies and conversations.
And that's a really good point, I think, about that normalization, because I think it's a cultural issue, and actually in some ways it's a UK culture issue then potentially as well, because we don't see it in like countries like the Netherlands and other places like that. Yeah, I do say that I've raised 2 feminists, and I'm quite proud of that. Well, hopefully 3, because one of them's a girl, but definitely, because, you know, you would want, and I certainly do see that in my own children, that they've got a strong sense of what's fair and what's right. So, and they would be quite put out if they thought that their sister would miss out just because of their gender, for instance, not just because they were her older brothers. But David, can I bring you in here? Because from an organisational perspective, you work with lots of organisations, you know, how can we engage men more in conversations about diversity and inclusion when they probably feel, well, this has nothing to do with me, I'm the baddie in the equation, if you like. So how do we get men more involved in this to support inclusivity and fairness?
Yeah, it's an interesting take. How do we get them more involved? Because actually a lot of people they won't tell you that they're part of the problem. So because they're not part of the problem, or they don't perceive they're part of the problem, that they actually don't include themselves in it, because it's okay, I don't need to do this, I don't do this, I'm not part of the problem. The reality is, and we talked about inclusive leadership, and it should just be leadership. We're actually now talking about inclusive responsibility. It is everybody's responsibility. And it's not just how you show up in the moment, it's the subtext. It's that, how do you show up when you're not in the room? What are you doing? What's the premise of your email? You know, how is that passive aggressive? How can that be taken differently? We talk about the more we are aware, the more we can control. And it's really important that self-awareness now becomes part of the norm until such times as actually it is the norm. And everybody recognizes it when it's not the norm. And that's when everyone goes, whoa, hold on a second, that was out of order, rather than, yeah, I quite like what you did there, I'll try and do that. We're trying to turn it on its head. So, you know, organizations need to take accountability. And if you go back probably, I would say probably 5 years ago, things like unconscious bias, things like, you know, women in business, these were staple diets that went all the way around business, and they were like tick box exercises that people did. They watched videos, they come back, yeah, I've done all of that. I've done an IAT test. Yeah, everything looks great. I'm all right. But it's almost like it doesn't involve me. It does. And Joe, the point is, you've got to get that through the leadership in business, that it's everybody's responsibility. So it comes back to removing mediocre or poor leaders, get them out of the business. Boards actually appoint the CEOs on a regular basis. Let's get some good CEOs in. Let's get some good board members in. Let's move the female NEDs from being NEDs to actually board members, you know, etc. Let's get that talent pool going. I can't tell you how important that talent pool will be for organizations for it to become the norm. So, you know, I'm sorry for going off on one there, Joe, but that's so important.
No, I love your passion for the absolute topic, and I think to link into, you know, a point Iwi made as well, it's actually just about leadership. You know, we have got an inclusive, at the Institute, we have got an inclusive leadership podcast series that we run. And actually, it's just about being a really good, fair leader, treating people as individuals, being fair to them for whatever their preferences are, their strengths, where they have to develop, and just being a really good leader should lead to inclusive organisations, but we're not there yet. And that's why we've got all of these different things to support us in that journey. And actually talking about not there yet, because a bigger piece, Iwi, can I bring you in? Because also there's a whole point about intersectionality. So we're focused on like gender right at this moment in time, but there are wider consequences, you know, when you start to bring in intersectionality. So how do we ensure that diversity and inclusion efforts are inclusive for all women of various background and identities, and that they share in that? We're not there if we even just look at gender, but actually, you know, the story gets even more negative when we start to look at other factors.
Yeah, I think the EDI activity in organisations is really focused on diversity, and the tick box stuff that David spoke about, I think, is symptomatic of that. I think even in higher education, I don't think people really understand intersectionality. They think of it as a kind of bundling of characteristics. You know, Louisa is a white mum. I don't know any of the characteristics, Louisa, but the point is, you know, you've got these different identity markers, and that's what makes Louisa Louisa. And I think what people fail to recognise with intersectionality is, so it has its origins in Black feminist theory, first of all. Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term because she's a lawyer, and there was a legal case that was going on, and she was using the principle to talk about the fact that the legal system works differently for Black women than it does for white women, for example, in this particular case. And what intersectionality does is it provides a lens to understand that, yes, people with different characteristics will encounter discrimination, kind of where power meets bias, in different ways. And, you know, we can both be women, but me as a Black woman, you as a white woman will experience the world very differently. And so what does that mean for inclusion and belonging and a sense of mattering in organisations? And I think for me, it comes back to, firstly, the idea of understanding intersectionality and that experiences are different. And there are certain types of discrimination that compound. So it's not additive, it's kind of transformative, because that gives you some sense of the magnitude of the discrimination that might then be pulled through in the policies that you have. But also, I think there's something then about what does that mean for inclusion? And I think that's, again, where companies are just not there. And we've spoken about it, you know, this idea that you need to meet people where they are. And as you said, Joe, you know, you need to recognize people as individuals. And it's not just about their kind of protected characteristics, it's other aspects of their identity, you know, it's what career breaks, it's experience gaps or experience differences. It's looking at the individual as an individual and recognizing the things that they need it to be put in place to enable them to provide the value to you as an organisation that they can do. And that looks different for everybody. And I come back to this point of inclusivity by design. And it's not easy. It's a really difficult thing. But for me, we're just nowhere. We're nowhere near where we need to be. Sorry to be down on that.
No, I think that's a really fair, and it's a really fair point, because actually one of our listeners has raised a point as well, is that, you know, white male are not just a homogenous group as well. You know, there's many different characteristics, which mean, and actually from an intersectionality perspective as well, mean that they are also discriminated against in different ways, and it's not an inclusive and fair world for them. Just conscious of time that we've got, so I think I'm probably just going to do maybe a last word from all of you, just around, you know, what would be your key advice to get us towards a more inclusive working environment for all. So what would be your top tip? So maybe David, come to you first of all on that.
Yeah, so it's really, really simple. I would say you need to get the right people working with the right behaviors, creating the right environment. Now, it's really simple. It's not easy. And the minute you get a dissenter who's not doing that, you have to jump on it, because it becomes like a vortex and it just drags everything down into this spiral. You're like your lowest common denominator. So really simple. Right people, right behaviors, right environment. And that comes back to strong leadership all the way through.
Thank you so much, Iwi. Sorry, David. Iwi, just coming to you. Anything that you would give as your takeaway?
I think I would say something that David's already mentioned, which is about our individual responsibility and accountability. It's easy for me to pontificate and talk about the things that I think should happen. But, you know, I'm very aware, even in my own practice, some of the biases, some of the language that I don't have, and some of the knowledge gaps that I, you know, need around, for example, trans inclusion. And I'm learning constantly. And I think we all need to take collective responsibility for the way in which we treat others in the workplace, and that kindness goes a long way.
Yeah, it sure does. Louisa, last word.
I think linked to both what David and Iwi have said, I think creating a culture that's open, that's built on strong leadership, where people are sort of held to account if they don't, the behaviours aren't what, you know, behaviours that we would want to see, but encouraging that openness where people can speak up and people can feel that they're empowered to speak up, and allowing sort of choice and options to people. I think that's really key, I suppose, linked to the fact that, you know, we're not one homogenous group. Everybody's situation is completely different, and what one person thinks of as, you know, their aim or their success is not going to be somebody else's. So it's all about creating opportunities where people have choices and have options that work for them.
I think that does link into that whole thing about ultimately inclusive leadership. You know, it's just good leadership that's tailored towards the individual, regardless of who they are. So get to know people, get to know what they like, what their strengths are, build on that, and treat people fairly. So, and I think just on that whole point, we can all take something ourselves. What do we need to learn more? Who's the colleague that we don't speak to in the room? Who is it that we don't know very well? Take the time to get to know people to make sure that we are giving everybody that fair opportunity. But yeah, some great takeaways. Thank you so much, panel. There's lots to take away. I'm going to think about that collective responsibility and inclusive responsibility as well, in terms of leadership. Great thoughts. The hour runs past. Apologies for the little technical hitch earlier. And David, thank you so much for stepping in and for our audience listening today. So thank you, David, Iwi and Louisa. Great conversation. And our audience, if you'd like to share the webcast with others, it'll be available on our YouTube channel, where you can find it. And please do so. Hopefully you've learned a lot from today's session, and happy International Women's Day to everyone tomorrow. Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.